If you value careful historical analysis over simplified war stories, subscribe to the Survival Record now. This channel exists for viewers who understand that survival in wartime was shaped as much by logistics and overlooked decisions as by weapons and tactics. Today's subject challenges a common assumption that soldiers in World War II starved only when supply lines collapsed. In reality, food was often nearby, sometimes abundant, but hidden in places opposing forces rarely thought to search, or deliberately chose not to. The failure to recognize these storage methods cost time, lives, and operational momentum, and it reshaped how modern militaries think about concealment, logistics, and resilience. Most soldiers were trained to look for food where doctrine told them it should be: depots, warehouses, transport columns, and civilian homes. But total war forced civilians, resistance groups, and even regular armies to adapt in quieter, less obvious ways. Food was hidden not just to survive hunger, but to control behavior, deny resources, and outlast occupation. These storage choices reveal how war was experienced on the margins, away from front lines and official reports, and why preparedness is often invisible until it fails. Food was quietly hidden in graveyards because soldiers avoided disturbing the dead. Across occupied Eastern Europe, graveyards became unlikely storage sites for grain, root vegetables, and preserved meats. Civilians and partisan groups understood that soldiers, regardless of nationality, were reluctant to dig among graves unless absolutely necessary. This reluctance was partly cultural, partly practical. Digging disrupted morale, offended local populations, and consumed time with little expectation of reward. In rural Poland, Ukraine, and Belarus, families buried sealed containers beneath fresh graves or within unused plots. Some used coffins as false covers, placing food beneath shallow burial layers while leaving markers intact. German anti-partisan units recorded repeated failures to locate food stores in villages that appeared destitute, only to discover months later that sustenance had been hidden in cemeteries they never searched. This practice influenced post-war counterinsurgency doctrine. Modern forces learned that cultural taboos could be deliberately leveraged as defensive tools, and that assumptions about off-limits terrain often favor the defender. Abandoned rail sidings stored food long after trains stopped running. Railways were prime targets during the war, and once lines were bombed or sabotaged, many sidings were written off as useless. Yet food shipments were often unloaded hastily before attacks or rerouted and left behind when priorities shifted. In France, Italy, and the Soviet Union, crates of dried goods, flour, and tinned meat sat untouched in overgrown sidings for months or even years. Soldiers passing through assumed that anything valuable would have been looted already. They focused searches on stations and depots, not dead-end spurs. Resistance groups exploited this blind spot, quietly retrieving supplies under cover of routine rail maintenance or civilian labor. The lesson here is logistical inertia. Once infrastructure is deemed inactive, it becomes invisible. Later military planners would emphasize the need to reassess abandoned systems rather than dismiss them outright. Church walls and monasteries often concealed food behind a veil of religious neutrality. They weren't always the safe havens one might imagine, but they occupied a rather complicated position in territories under occupation. In Catholic regions especially, occupying forces often shied away from invasive searches to prevent any unrest. Clergy, seizing this opportunity, cleverly concealed food within double walls, attics, and sealed basements. Monasteries in Italy and France stored grain and wine behind false masonry or beneath altar platforms. These hidden supplies fed civilians, refugees, and resistance fighters, all while remaining undetected. Soldiers who did search these sacred spaces tended to focus on finding weapons or fugitives, not the cleverly hidden food stores built into the structure itself. This whole phenomenon really shows how institutional trust can become a vital survival asset. Religious buildings offered more than just spiritual refuge. They provided logistical concealment that reshaped how communities endured occupation. Flooded cellars were often dismissed, even when deliberately preserved. You see, urban combat zones created widespread flooding as water mains broke and drainage systems failed. Many cellars filled partially with water and were just assumed unusable. But in reality, residents often elevated food on platforms or sealed it in waterproof containers. During the siege of Leningrad, some apartment blocks maintained submerged storage areas where frozen conditions preserved food for months. German and later Soviet troops, entering damaged buildings, avoided these flooded basements due to the risk of disease and structural instability. As a result, food stores managed to survive even during the most intense shortages. This practice highlights an important survival principle. Environments perceived as hostile or unusable can still be managed by those who understand them. Modern disaster preparedness continues to emphasize adaptation rather than the abandonment of compromised spaces. Forests, in a way, hid food in plain sight through deliberate overfamiliarity. Despite being searched constantly for partisans, food caches hidden there often went unnoticed. The reason? Psychological fatigue. Soldiers, you see, learned to associate forests with ambush, not storage. When caches were found, they were often assumed to be temporary or already emptied. In places like Yugoslavia and the Baltic states, resistance groups buried food in marked but seemingly mundane locations, beneath fallen logs, inside hollow trees, or under animal trails. These spots blended into the terrain soldiers thought they already understood. This repeated failure to locate supplies reinforced a dangerous assumption that if something were there, it would already have been found. This assumption allowed long-term survival networks to function under constant pressure. Industrial ruins became food vaults once they lost strategic value. Bombed factories and warehouses were stripped of machinery and then, well, ignored. Yet food was frequently stored in remaining sub-levels, ventilation shafts, or sealed rooms that no longer appeared functional. In Germany itself, civilians hid dried foods and preserves in damaged industrial buildings to avoid requisition. Allied troops focused on military assets rarely conducted thorough searches once sites were declared non-operational. This really reveals how strategic prioritization creates blind spots. What no longer serves a war effort may still sustain human life, a distinction often overlooked in military planning. Livestock feed was quietly repurposed as human food. Animal feed was rarely confiscated unless livestock were present. Yet, in desperate conditions, grains and legumes intended for animals became critical food sources. Civilians hid these supplies openly, knowing soldiers did not consider them edible. During the Dutch hunger winter, some families survived on animal feed stored in barns and sheds. German troops focused on human food stocks and overlooked these reserves entirely. This blurred line between civilian and military logistics later influenced humanitarian planning, particularly in recognizing non-traditional food sources during famine. Personal burial kits carried more food than official rations. Soldiers themselves sometimes hid food unknowingly. Emergency burial kits, tool rolls, and equipment compartments were modified to carry extra rations. When soldiers were killed or reassigned, these supplies remained with the equipment. Battlefield scavenging rarely included detailed inspection of such items. Over time, small caches accumulated in trenches, dugouts, and abandoned positions. This really underscores how individual adaptation can quietly shape survival outcomes even when official systems fail. Understanding these hidden food storage practices matters because they reveal how survival depends on perception as much as supply. Wars are not only fought with weapons but with assumptions about where value lies, what is worth searching, and what can be ignored. The people who survived longest were often those who understood how to exploit those assumptions without confrontation. If you value this kind of in-depth historical analysis, subscribe to the Survival Record. And if this video helped you see World War II through a more grounded and human lens, share it with others who care about understanding the past beyond the surface.